My name is Jake Mitchell. I'm 31, a corn farmer from Nebraska. Last month, when the bank threatened to take my family's 150-year-old farm, I never imagined that digging a new well would uncover a secret that would change everything. The eviction notice had been sitting on my kitchen table for 3 days. $60,000 in back payments, or lose everything my great-grandfather built with his bare hands. My wife Sarah was working double shifts at the diner in town, and our 8-year-old daughter Emma kept asking why Mommy cried at night. The drought had killed 2 consecutive crops, and the insurance company found every excuse not to pay out. I was down to my last $200 and a prayer when I decided to dig that well. The old water pump had died in July, and without irrigation, the remaining corn was withering under the relentless sun. I borrowed my neighbor Tom's drill rig, figuring if I could hit groundwater, maybe I could save what was left of this year's crop. About 12 feet down, the drill bit hit something hard. Not rock, something metallic. When I pulled it up, there were scratches on the steel that looked deliberate, like markings. That's when I found the metal box. It was buried in a concrete casing, wrapped in plastic that had somehow survived decades underground. Inside were documents, photographs, and a handwritten letter dated 1987. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this, and signed by a man named Charles Whitmore. I'd heard that name before. He'd been the richest man in the county before he disappeared mysteriously 30 years ago. People said he'd fled to South America with stolen money, but his body was found in a car accident 2 weeks after he vanished. The documents in the box told a different story. Charles hadn't stolen anything. He discovered that 3 prominent businessmen in our county, including our current mayor, Richard Sterling, had been embezzling federal farming subsidies for decades. The scheme had stolen millions from struggling farmers like me, money that was supposed to help us survive droughts and market crashes. Charles had gathered proof, bank records, forged signatures, everything needed to expose them. But Charles never got the chance to go public. The final document was a photocopy of a death certificate. His death certificate, with a handwritten note in the margin. They got to the coroner too. This wasn't an accident. If something happens to me, the evidence is buried on the Mitchell farm, 12 feet down, southwest corner. The photo was dated yesterday, but Charles Whitmore had been dead for 30 years. I stared at that box until sunrise, my hands shaking as I read through federal investigation reports, witness statements, and bank transfers that painted a picture of systematic corruption. The 3 men Charles had been investigating were now the most powerful people in our county. Mayor Sterling owned half the businesses in town, including the bank that was foreclosing on my farm. Judge Harold Crane had been appointed to the county court shortly after Charles died. And Police Chief Dennis Murphy had been promoted to his position just weeks after the accident. The next morning, I called the state attorney general's office. I figured with evidence this solid, justice would be swift and clean. I was wrong. The secretary told me someone would get back to me. But when I called again 2 days later, she claimed no record of my call existed. When I mentioned Mayor Sterling's name, the line went dead. That afternoon, Sterling himself showed up at my farm in his black Mercedes, accompanied by a man I didn't recognize. Tall, expensive suit, cold eyes. Sterling had always been friendly to me in public, the glad-handing politician who remembered everyone's name. But the man standing in my yard was different, calculating, dangerous. "Jake," Sterling said, smiling that practiced smile I'd seen 1,000 times at county fairs. "I heard you've been asking questions about old Charlie Whitmore. That's ancient history, son. No point digging up the past." He paused, looking around at my dying crops and broken-down equipment. "I also heard the bank's been giving you trouble. What if I told you I could make those problems disappear? $60,000 wiped clean. All you'd need to do is forget about whatever you think you found." The unnamed man never spoke, but he didn't need to. His presence was threat enough. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, my mouth suddenly dry. "I'm just trying to dig a well. Sterling's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. Of course you are. Just remember, Jake, this county takes care of its own, but only the ones who know how to keep their mouths shut. He slid a business card into my shirt pocket. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. After they left, I noticed the man in the suit had been taking photographs of my house, my truck, and the license plate on Sarah's car. That night, I moved the metal box to a safety deposit box in the next county. But I kept copies of everything hidden in my barn. The harassment started immediately. My internet service was mysteriously canceled. The power company claimed I'd missed payments I knew I'd made and threatened to shut off electricity. Sarah's shifts at the diner were suddenly reduced to just 2 days a week. The owner mumbled something about economic pressures, but wouldn't look her in the eye. Emma came home from school crying because kids were teasing her about us being deadbeat farmers. Then the accident started. My truck's brake lines were cut while it was parked outside the feed store. I only discovered it because Tom noticed fluid pooling under the vehicle. The next week, someone loosened the wheels on Sarah's car. She felt it wobbling on her way to work and barely made it to a garage. The mechanic said if she'd been driving any faster, the wheels would have come off on the highway. But the worst part was the isolation. People who'd known my family for generations suddenly crossed the street to avoid talking to me. The hardware store owner, who'd extended credit to my father for 20 years, demanded cash only. Even our pastor seemed nervous when I showed up for Sunday service, cutting his conversation short when I approached. I was beginning to understand why Charles Whitmore had hidden his evidence instead of taking it straight to the authorities. In a small county, these 3 men controlled everything: the courts, the police, the banks, even the newspapers. Going up against them wasn't just fighting corruption. It was fighting an entire system designed to protect itself. 3 weeks after finding the box, I discovered they'd been watching my house. I spotted the same dark sedan parked on different streets near my property, always with a clear view of our front door. When I tried to approach it one evening, the car sped away, but not before I caught a partial license plate. That's when I realized Sarah was getting phone calls at work. Calls where no one spoke, just heavy breathing and the sound of traffic in the background. Emma mentioned that a nice man had approached her at the school playground, asking questions about Daddy's farm and whether we'd found anything interesting lately. The school said they had no record of any approved visitor that day. I was trapped. The evidence I'd found could destroy 3 of the most powerful men in the county, but I had no way to safely get it to anyone who mattered. Every official channel seemed compromised, and my family was being threatened. The bank's deadline was approaching, and without Sterling's help, we'd lose everything anyway. Then I made the mistake of trusting someone I shouldn't have. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had moved to town 6 months earlier, setting up a legal aid practice to help struggling farmers fight foreclosures. She was smart, beautiful, and passionate about justice. Exactly the kind of ally I desperately needed. When she approached me at the farmer's market, claiming she'd heard about my situation and wanted to help, it felt like a miracle. Rebecca listened to my story with the kind of focused attention I hadn't experienced in weeks. She examined copies of Charles Whitmore's evidence with the sharp eye of someone who understood both law and corruption. She promised to use her contacts at the state level to ensure the documents reached honest investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "This is exactly the kind of systemic abuse I came here to fight," she told me, her green eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Charles Whitmore died because he was brave enough to stand up to these men. We won't let his sacrifice be meaningless." For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. Rebecca took digital copies of everything, promising to create multiple backup files and distribute them to journalists, federal investigators, and advocacy groups that specialized in agricultural fraud. She had a plan to coordinate a simultaneous release of information that would make it impossible for Sterling, Crane, and Murphy to cover up their crimes. But something felt wrong from the beginning. Rebecca asked too many specific questions about my daily routine, my family's schedule, and exactly where I'd hidden the original documents. She wanted to meet at odd times and in isolated locations, claiming she was worried about surveillance. When I suggested bringing Sarah to one of our meetings, Rebecca quickly found excuses why that wouldn't work. The pieces didn't fall into place until I saw her leaving the courthouse after what should have been a private meeting with Judge Crane. They were walking together like old friends, and when Crane placed his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was far too familiar, I realized I'd been played. Rebecca Hayes wasn't a legal aid lawyer fighting for struggling farmers. She was bait, a sophisticated trap designed to draw out anyone who might have evidence against the three men who'd been running this county like their personal kingdom for 30 years. Her law degree was real, but her passion for justice was carefully crafted performance. That night, she called to arrange another meeting, her voice warm with fake concern. "I've got great news about your case, Jake. I think we're ready to move forward." But I'd already made my decision. Instead of meeting her, I drove to the next county and spent the night in a motel, trying to figure out my next move. The betrayal cut deep, but it also clarified something important. I was completely alone in this fight. There was no one in the county I could trust, no institution that hadn't been compromised, no safe harbor for my family. Sterling, Crane, and Murphy had built a system so complete and so ruthless that they could manufacture allies, manipulate evidence, and destroy lives without consequence. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated how far a desperate man would go to protect his family. The next morning brought devastating news. Sarah called, her voice broken with tears. The bank had accelerated the foreclosure process. Instead of having 2 more weeks, we now had 3 days to pay the full amount owed or lose the farm. Judge Crane had signed the order personally, citing new information about the property's condition that made immediate action necessary. Worse, the State Child Services had received an anonymous tip about unsafe living conditions at our farm. A caseworker was coming that afternoon to evaluate whether Emma should be removed from our home. The complaint specifically mentioned our financial instability and recent erratic behavior. When I arrived home, I found 2 sheriff's deputies searching my barn. They had a warrant signed by Judge Crane, authorizing them to look for stolen property and evidence of insurance fraud. Deputy Martinez, who'd bought me drinks just last month, wouldn't meet my eyes as he overturned feed bins and pulled apart equipment. They didn't find the original documents. I'd moved them days earlier, but they didn't need to. The search was theater, a public demonstration that I was now officially a suspect in some unnamed crime. By evening, everyone in the county would know that Jake Mitchell was being investigated for fraud. The caseworker who came to evaluate Emma was thorough, professional, and clearly operating from information she shouldn't have had. She knew about Sarah's reduced work hours, our mounting debts, and even the dangerous equipment on the property. When she interviewed Emma privately, my 8-year-old daughter came out confused and frightened, asking why the lady wanted to know if Daddy had been acting scary lately. That evening, Rebecca called one final time. Her mask had slipped completely, and the woman on the phone was cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "You should have taken the deal, Jake," she said. "Richard was willing to be generous. Now you're going to lose everything anyway, plus your daughter. The Child Services report is already written. Emma will be in foster care by Friday, and Sarah will blame you for destroying the family. All because you couldn't leave the past buried." She paused, and I could hear her smiling through the phone. Charles Whitmore thought he was a hero too. Look how that worked out for him. The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of everything I tried to protect. The farm would be gone in 3 days. Emma might be taken away tomorrow, and the evidence that could bring justice for Charles Whitmore and dozens of other victims would die with me. But as I sat there in the darkness, something occurred to me. Rebecca, Sterling, and the others had made their own mistake. They'd assumed I was fighting alone. They'd forgotten about Mary Whitmore. Charles Whitmore's widow had remarried and moved to California decades ago, but I'd found her address in the old documents. She was now Mary Chun, a retired teacher living in Sacramento. Unlike everyone else, she was beyond the reach of Sterling's influence, and she had her own reasons for wanting justice. I called her that night, and when I explained what I'd found, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears I could hear. "I knew Charlie didn't run away," she said. "He loved this place too much, and I knew that car accident was no accident. They killed my husband to steal from people like you." She paused. "I've been waiting 30 years for this call." Mary Chun wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a retired federal contractor who'd spent her career in the Department of Agriculture, and she knew exactly who to contact about systematic subsidy fraud. More importantly, she had connections who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or murdered. Within 48 hours, federal investigators were in the county, armed with search warrants that Judge Crane couldn't dismiss and evidence that Police Chief Murphy couldn't lose. The investigation moved so quickly that Sterling, Crane, and Murphy didn't have time to coordinate their cover-up stories. The federal agents found financial records in Sterling's office that matched Charles Whitmore's evidence perfectly. Murphy's home computer contained deleted emails discussing the Mitchell problem and contingency plans for dealing with potential witnesses. Judge Crane's bank accounts showed deposits that coincided exactly with fraudulent subsidy payments. But the final nail in their coffins came from an unexpected source: Rebecca Hayes herself. Faced with federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder, Rebecca decided to save herself. She'd been recording her conversations with Sterling, Crane, and Murphy as insurance against them eventually betraying her. When the federal investigators offered her a plea deal, she handed over files that documented 30 years of corruption, including recorded phone calls where the three men casually discussed murdering Charles Whitmore. The trials were swift and thorough. Sterling was sentenced to 25 years for fraud, conspiracy, and ordering Whitmore's murder. Crane got 20 years for abuse of office and obstruction of justice. Murphy received 15 years for evidence tampering and conspiracy. Rebecca Hayes served 3 years in federal prison but was released early for cooperating with the investigation. The federal investigation also uncovered the full scope of the subsidy fraud. Over 3 decades, the three men had stolen more than $12 million in federal farming assistance. The restitution payments meant that every affected farmer in the county received compensation for their losses, plus interest. My family received $240,000, enough to save the farm, modernize our equipment, and put money aside for Emma's college education. But more importantly, we got our lives back. Sarah returned to full-time work by choice, not necessity. Emma stopped having nightmares about bad men taking Daddy away, and I learned to trust my neighbors again, slowly but surely. The farm is thriving now. The new irrigation system means we're no longer at the mercy of drought, and the modern equipment has tripled our productivity. Last month, Emma won first prize at the county fair for her 4-H project, a research paper about her great-great-grandfather's homestead. I thought our story was over. Justice had been served, the corrupt officials were in prison, and my family was safe. The Mitchell farm would survive another generation, just like my great-grandfather had intended. But last Tuesday, while cleaning out the old barn, I found something that changed everything again. Hidden behind a loose board, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a metal container, were more documents. Not from Charles Whitmore this time, but from my own grandfather, dated 1962. The papers detailed another conspiracy, bigger than the subsidy fraud, involving land deals and federal contracts that stretched from our county all the way to Washington, D.C. My grandfather had discovered that powerful men were using small-town farms as fronts for money laundering and illegal weapons sales during the Cold War. The evidence was meticulously documented, photographed, and preserved. And according to his final note, some of the people involved were still alive, still powerful, and still dangerous. At the bottom of the container was a letter addressed to his descendants. If you're reading this, then the corruption in this county runs deeper than anyone imagined. The men I investigated in 1962 have sons and grandsons now. They're still here, still stealing, and still killing to protect their secrets. What happened to Charles Whitmore was just the beginning. I thought my troubles were over. I was wrong. The conspiracy my grandfather uncovered makes the subsidy fraud look like petty theft. And this time, the people involved have connections that reach all the way to the federal government. The phone is ringing now. Unknown number. Just like the calls that started this whole nightmare. But this time I'm ready. This time, I know what I'm fighting for, and I know I won't be fighting alone. My name is Jake Mitchell. I'm a corn farmer from Nebraska, and I'm about to uncover a secret that could shake the foundations of American power.